Welcome, I'm your host Kenny, and you're listening to Social Sleuth. Today we are joined by Dr. William K. Carroll, aka Bill, who is a critical sociologist and professor at the University of Victoria. I was a student of Bill's for a capstone class, and beyond his decades of experience, he is an exemplary scholar. Upon reaching out for this interview, Bill was kind enough to share his new book, Refusing Ecocide, with me, so this episode will branch a bit beyond the traditional scope of Social Sleuth, because as I shared with Bill, the climate crisis cannot be separated from any culture, including that of the internet.
Drum roll, please. Can anybody guess?
Welcome, Bill. Thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome.
Kind of just jump right into it. I wanted to ask you how you got here and how you expanded from a sociological perspective and then brought in this interdisciplinary approach to your work.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, I started out as a social psychologist, actually. So my undergraduate degree was in sociology way back in the early 70s. But the department I was studying in was very microsociologically oriented. So it was very much oriented to understanding how people manage their interpersonal relationships and how they develop, attitudes and values through social interactions and that kind of thing. So at a fairly micro level. And then in graduate school, I sort of turned toward more macro sociology and political economy, more of a critical approach to sociology. I was at a different university, York University in Toronto. And so I had somewhat of an interdisciplinary approach coming out of graduate school in terms of social psychology at the micro level and political economy at the macro level. But I think the other thing I would say, and I've written about this, that sociology itself is a discipline that's almost inherently interdisciplinary. Its boundaries are very fuzzy. So for example, there's sociology. There's political sociology, which is hard to distinguish from political science, actually. There's economic sociology that takes up issues of economy, but from a kind of more relational sociological perspective and that kind of thing. So it's a discipline that lends itself to interdisciplinarity. And I had these interdisciplinary sensibilities coming out of graduate school. So they gradually developed, I'd say, over my career. And then we started up a critical social theory program in the late 1980s here at UVic called Cultural, Social, and Political Thought. It's a graduate program, very successful. And again, it's a very interdisciplinary program. So that also led me in that direction. And then in 2007, I guess, I brought together a group of people on campus to develop a social justice studies program. So again, very interdisciplinary. And we had colleagues from different departments, social work and gender studies and anthropology and philosophy and so on and so forth, So that was also very interdisciplinary. So I guess my approach has been interdisciplinary for some time and increasingly so because I don't really see that the boundaries among the social sciences are really hard and fixed. I think they're all pretty fuzzy and we're all trying to understand the human condition in its complexity. And to do that, we actually need to take, use different lenses, right? And so I think interdisciplinarity is really an important movement within the social sciences and even more broadly, to try to break out of the silos of knowledge as it's been historically constructed.
Thank you for sharing that. I was kind of thinking of the lenses and the more is more approach on my way over here.
Yeah, sure.
And then more into what I would think is your focus or your research currently or in the most recent past, but about ecocide and the environment and fossil fuels. So what is ecocide for people that aren't familiar?
Yeah. Well, ecocide is basically the purposeful destruction of ecological systems and life systems. And it's obviously when we say ecocide, people think of suicide. It's not the same thing, but in a sense, suicide is a direct kind of killing of oneself, right? By one's own hand. And so it's an act of direct violence against oneself. But I mean, a lot of violence in this world is structural violence, and it's not this direct, really obvious, immediate violence, but it's like, for example, living in poverty shortens people's life expectancy. That's a form of structural violence. And similarly with ecocide, it's a kind of structural thing. Like it's similar to suicide because we are basically killing our own life support systems, right? But we're not doing it, killing ourselves directly. We're sort of committing this kind of ecocide if we continue along the path that we're on. Like nothing is inevitable in this, but currently the path that we're on is ecocidal. And so I entitled my latest book, Refusing Ecocide.
Absolutely. Get a little bit more into that.
Yeah.
And this is from the book that you're speaking of, but how in a general sense does historical materialism, which from my understanding is accumulation, imperialism, and hegemony, act to reinforce the conditions for ecocide to be permitted?
Yeah.
Because like you said, it's not an inevitable.
Yes, exactly. And the book really, that's the central lens that I'm using, or group of lenses, if you like. And those three concepts, accumulation, imperialism, and hegemony, have been quite central within historical materialism, or Marxism, if you like. And the accumulation piece is really something that Marx himself developed in the 19th century in his critical analysis of capitalism. So he understands capitalism as a specific form of human economy, a mode of production, and that capitalism, the accumulation of capital involves a kind of profit-driven process of grow or die. Like every company needs to grow in order to stay competitive. And then when you scale that up to a macro level, it means that the entire footprint of capitalism is constantly expanding, right? And capitalism, as capitalists try to, strive to accumulate capital and maximize profit, and then reinvest their profits. That's the growth dynamic of endless growth that is baked into capitalism. The thing is, though, in the accumulation process, that all of this production of goods and services on an expanding basis requires an enormous amount of energy, an increasing amount of energy. And 85% of that energy comes from fossil fuels. So that's why we call capitalism fossil capitalism, that it's a form of capitalism that requires the burning of fossil fuels on an expanding scale, as the capital itself is accumulating on an expanding scale. So that's the first piece of it, the kind of problem of accumulation, endless growth, and therefore increasing carbon emissions, right? And we can see this especially in the second half of the 20th century, when consumer capitalism became the basic model for capitalism in the global north. And so, all kinds of consumer goods and automobiles and houses, everybody owning their own house and so on and so forth. All of that kind of affluent consumer capitalism became the model for how people should live, the model for capitalist modernity. So it's been spreading over the world. And of course, when we look at it, at how that model actually plays out, we're led to the second concept in the book, which is the concept of imperialism, because in order to actually create this affluent consumer capitalism, particularly in the global north, and of course a lot of people in the global north don't live in affluence at all, but there is that kind of, American dream, if you like, of becoming affluent that a lot of people buy into, even if they're not affluent. But all of this kind of system of consumer capitalism in the North has relied on imperialism in the sense of extracting resources from the South and employing cheap labor in the global South, often putting communities and countries in the global South under an enormous debt burden, and just making it very difficult for like the majority world, like basically 7/8 of the world's population, to really develop and meet their needs and develop their the capacities to live rich lives as human beings. So that's the imperialism piece, and capitalism relies on a kind of resource imperialism, sometimes called eco-imperialism, which involves often degrading the ecosystems in the global South, right, mining and deforestation and so on, in order to provide these goods and services in the global North. So that kind of, sometimes called the imperial mode of living, is part of the structure of global capitalism, and it's summarized in that concept of imperialism, where you have, the strong states of the global North, especially the United States as an exemplar, really exercise coercive control over much of the global South, right? Through, the whatever 200 military bases the United States has around the world and all the other things. The debt dependency is an important aspect of imperialism as well. And as I say, the whole kind of extractivism, extracting resources and mining and all of that, often to the detriment of communities and ecosystems in the global South. And then the third concept, hegemony, is something that was introduced more in the 20th century to try to understand the political and cultural aspects that stabilize capitalism as a way of life, that people consent to their own subordination. This is the idea in hegemony, that the dominant class actually is able to exercise leadership and accrue prestige for itself. Like when people say, well, it's the private sector that creates jobs, right? That's an expression of hegemony, right? That the private sector, that is to say, capitalists, are the ones who are actually creating the employment and enabling people to live the lives they live. When really, if we look at it, it's working people who create wealth, and capitalists appropriate that wealth. So they're not so much creating jobs, they're appropriating wealth, is the way I would look at it. And as a profit-driven way of life, as I say, those private interests that control the profit mechanism have enormous power, and their interests are in continually expanding their, capitalist empires. And ultimately this, as we've seen, especially in the 21st century now, it presses up against real ecological limits. And the climate crisis is the most obvious example of that.
That was a great overview.
Oh, okay.
Even though I had read or tried to just get through as much as I could before meeting you.
Yeah.
And I felt okay with what I was reading, but that definitely paints the picture, and I can see it very clearly. And it's upsetting.
Yes.
That's a very big understatement.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of rolling into my next question, I think a lot of people see this problem. Maybe they can't put the right language on it to describe it in the way and to understand our own position in the way that you just have. But it feels like we're constantly trying to be distracted from truly impactful climate solutions with these Band-Aid solutions.
Yeah. And
do you think that contributes to aspects of denial or passiveness towards the climate crisis?
Yeah, definitely. There's a sense in which people can feel, morally that they're doing their part, if they recycle. And I'm not saying there's something wrong with recycling. We should be recycling. But these kinds of things that are sort of at the micro level of everyday life and changing our, consumer patterns, what we're buying, how much of whatever it is we're buying, or are we recycling, and so on and so forth. They are part of the solution, but the main structural drivers of the crisis are really capitalist investment. And that is not something that any of the capitalist states want to address at all. And so there is a tremendous amount of, I would call it denialism. We, in the Corporate Mapping Project, which is a big collaborative effort we had here at UVic from 2015 to 2023 that I co-led, we came up with, the terminology of old and new denialism. And old denialism is where you deny that climate change is even happening. But new denialism, so like Donald Trump would be an example of an old denialist, right? And he's reactionary in many ways, but that's one of the ways he is. But new denialism is where you accept that there is a climate crisis. It is caused by human activity, but your solutions are these Band-Aid kinds of measures that won't really make that much of a difference. But the reason why they're adopted is because they don't disrupt the accumulation process. They don't disrupt capitalism in any way. They fit nicely within it, like the market-based measures, carbon offsets and carbon taxing and so on. You're just making these little changes without really addressing the generative mechanisms of the climate crisis itself. And there's all sorts of examples of this. And yeah, it is quite demoralizing. I think people, when they participate in these kind of individual activities of recycling, whatever it is, and they might feel a bit better about themselves, which is great, but at the same time, I think people are beginning to realize that, at least people paying attention, really, and connecting the dots. Because, that's one of the things about the climate crisis, that it is fairly easy to go into denial, because you actually have to have a scientific understanding of climate change to recognize that the symptoms are all actually manifestations of climate breakdown, like drought, and drought as well as extreme rainfall are both symptoms of climate change, right? Because the reliable climate system that we've known in the Holocene, right? This geological epoch that human communities have thrived within, we've taken that for granted, but that's what's breaking down, actually. And these Band-Aid measures are in no way adequate to the scale of the problem. And as I say, the problem is not so much on the consumption side in terms of the things we're buying in the grocery stores or what we're doing with our waste, whether we're recycling or not. All of that's good if we do recycle, but the major problems are on the production side and the investment side. We need to actually take control of that process from capitalists, democratize economic decision-making, and begin to make those decisions in the interests of both human communities and non-human nature. That's the argument in the book, basically.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I was just sort of thinking of all these different ways that it almost feels we're being bamboozled.
Yes, yeah.
And it's people wanting, with, I'm sure, good intentions to do better and to contribute.
Mm-hmm.
But it all feeds back into to capitalism and that sort of sales pitch of this is the new best thing. I think of electric cars, which in theory that should be great. There's no fossil fuels, but what about the production of those cars, the mining of the lithium for those batteries?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What you're actually plugging your car into and where that energy is coming from.
Exactly.
Which I know at least people around me are sort of seeing that, but that's not what's being sold en masse.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting concept of that old denialism versus the new denialism. I hadn't heard of that before. And it's good to differentiate.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sort of into another section of your book as well, but the atomized subject. I remember learning about in your class. And can you paint the picture of the atomized worker or the atomized subject?
Yeah. The atomized worker, this it comes out of the work of Michael Leibovitz and other people as well, who basically point out that if you go back to Marx and Engels and 1848 when they write the Communist Manifesto, right? There's a lot of famous statements in that document, but one of the things that they do is to paint a picture of the modern working class as a working class that is being thrown together into these big factories in urban centers, and having been thrown together, they they develop social relations with each other. They become organized as a working class, and then they can resist capitalist domination and ultimately overthrow the capitalist class, and so on and so forth. That's the narrative, right, of classical Marxism and then the Communist Manifesto. But what we find, and this relates to the concept of hegemony, right, of how people consent to their own subordination, that under capitalism, and especially the kind of capitalism we have today, a kind of neoliberal capitalism that really emphasizes markets and individual decision making. In that form of capitalism, workers are not socially and politically organized as a class, but they're atomized into individual subjects, individual people who basically make their decisions on the basis of the rationality of the marketplace. So they're going for the lowest price and the best deal they can get, basically. It's like the kind of orientation that someone like Donald Trump has to life. So in a sense, it's kind of adopting the standpoint of capital, that workers themselves begin to think of themselves as, having a certain amount of money that they want to spend rationally and trying to maximize their what they can get for their money. So, an atomized worker views other workers as competitors rather than as compatriots or comrades, right? As in the kind of narrative of the Communist Manifesto. So instead of that, you have atomized workers who are competing with each other to earn as much money so they can participate fully in consumer capitalism. And that basically makes it very difficult for the working class to resist the interests of capital, and that's sort of been the story, particularly in the era of neoliberalism, which begins in the 1980s. So it's a long, it's like a pretty nearly half a century now that we've been in this kind of pattern where relations of social solidarity are de-emphasized, and the independent entrepreneurial individual is sort of the featured kind of subject that we're all supposed to sort of emulate that. And if we do that, then through the magic of the marketplace, we'll all be better off, right? But what it actually does is to disempower the working class. And which, of course, in a capitalist system means that the capitalist class gains power. And the capitalist class is very well organized politically through all kinds of organizations, including political parties, but also think tanks and industry groups and various consensus-forming institutions and business roundtables and so on, and have lobbying organizations, foundations, corporate media, all of these different organizations, not as a conspiracy, but just as a very developed social structure, right? Or apparatus of accumulation and hegemony, accumulation and legitimation, that these various kinds of organizations of the capitalist class are the exact opposite of the atomized worker. So you have on one side the atomized worker, on the other side you have this really sophisticated apparatus of accumulation and legitimation. And that's sort of what the class struggle looks like now. It doesn't look very good, and it's particularly problematic in terms of the climate crisis, right? Because atomized workers tend to be primarily concerned about their economic welfare. They don't really think a lot beyond their own immediate interests, whereas the climate crisis, demands that we think beyond our immediate interests to deal with this issue as a species, right?
And I kind of think of like the current state, at least in our maybe local level, the cost of living increases, and then that need to be thinking of only right now and not the future.
Yeah,
just intensifies.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. The crisis that we're in, the initial impact of a crisis is usually to make people feel very conservative and they want to cling to what they know and what they have and not lose it, right? But we need to, in this situation, actually be thinking much more creatively about shifting our way of life. So that's another one of the paradoxes, of a crisis. On the one hand, it opens up the opportunities for change, because if the system isn't in crisis, then people certainly don't think about the need for change, right? But if the system is in crisis, the initial effect of that is that they're in denial quite often, and they don't really want change to happen. They want to hold on to what they have. The devil rather than the devil you don't know, that kind of psychological approach. So, yeah, I mean, that's another kind of, barrier. There's a lot of barriers, right, to effective climate action, but some of them are at that kind of social psychological level.
I had my little notes here of this, something that many feel the effects of being an atomized subject or worker, but you can't identify it. And then I guess I kind of shared this already, but it opens opportunity to consume more and then also take that opportunity for collective action away. That's just my 2 bits that I put down there.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that is the kind of logic of it. We tend to think in terms of our individual consumption, and we tend to not think in terms of community and the need to be responsible toward each other and toward non-human nature, right? It's just not that way of thinking, that ethic of solidarity and care, that just sort of goes out the window if you're so concerned about your immediate survival as an atomized worker, right?
Absolutely. Kind of rolls into my next question. You mentioned, again, in your book, the tendency of mainstream environmentalism towards depoliticalization. I'm wondering how that intersects with the atomized subject, and does that further entrench them in their social location?
Yeah. I think that has been the pattern in mainstream environmentalism, to think of solutions to the various environmental problems as coming from either, environmentally conscious consumers, so that kind of, the appropriate consumption, or technical side, like ecological scientists and technologies that will improve environmental conditions. But not so much thinking about, what within historical materialism we would call shifting the relations of production, as in democratizing the economy, actually creating a situation where our lives are not dominated so much by the need to accumulate capital, but rather the social logic is built around care for each other, care for the ecosystem, which is quite different from the private profit motive, and so that, I see a big contrast there. And mainstream environmentalism has generally not taken on capitalism and the profit motive and so on. So they work around the edges of that, mostly thinking about, technological changes and smart consumption. And it does. I mean, I think it relates to this whole individualizing approach within neoliberalism that reinforces this atomization of people, and then people begin to develop a sense that their political activity is enough to simply be a kind of politically conscious consumer. And that can be the sum total of your political activity. Or you might do that and also participate in clicktivism on the internet, So these kinds of really low-cost activities in terms of social movement activism become what people think of as politics, whereas really they don't really move the needle much. Those kinds of things. The real political organizing in the more classic sense of bringing people together in organizations that can accomplish something. When we think in these kinds of atomized, individualized, depoliticized terms, that just doesn't occur to people, that we should be actually building political organizations that have some real efficacy. But I think that is what we need to be doing.
This was not on the question. I wonder if you've been following along with Emily
Lowen? Yeah, I know Emily. She's a former student of mine.
And is that the sort of direction that you're talking about as she's calling out the capitalists?
Yeah. I have a lot of respect for Emily Lowen. I think she's an excellent leader. And Exactly. I formally endorsed her campaign for Green Party leadership in British Columbia. And I do think that her take on things is quite good. She recognizes the need for political organizing, the need to actually, as you say, call out capitalism and sort of break from this form of environmental politics that is, I think, depoliticizing. Yeah, absolutely.
I'll get off my little side tangent. You've kind of touched on it a little bit, but is this recentering of responsibility from the government and corporations onto the consumer, is that a symptom of capitalism, or is that an intentional thing that's being done?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think it's both. I think we can see the social logic and structures of capital pushing in that direction into responsible lives and sort of push the burden onto individuals, which means that corporations can realize higher profits, right, if you can do that. And corporations don't need to make fundamental changes if you can just sort of shift the burden onto the consumer and the individual in the marketplace. But it's definitely the case that the corporate sector has been lobbying and influencing public opinion, right, in order to shore up their position and make sure that there isn't any kind of major change. And they're very effective at that. We studied corporate lobbying in terms of the fossil fuel sector in Canada in the Corporate Mapping Project, and we found that the network of corporate lobbyists for the fossil fuel industry is incredibly extensive, and it just sort of outshines all of these other lobbying efforts by environmental groups or indigenous groups. They are just left in the dust by these really well-resourced lobbying organizations of the fossil fuel industry. And they're meeting on several times a week with top government officials in Ottawa. And so we've documented that in our research. And there's a lot of other mechanisms similar to that, in the sense of, for example, there are regulatory agencies in Canada, like the Canada Energy Regulator, used to be called the National Energy Board. In BC, we have the BC Utilities or Oil and Gas Commission, actually, which I think has been renamed recently as well. But, these are examples of captured regulators, because if you look at how they function and even how their top personnel are chosen and everything, they're just really closely inclined toward the industries that they're regulating, and generally they will green light almost all proposals. So there's a lot of aspects to the power structure, and this is what we were exploring in the Corporate Mapping Project. But I think, I think that it is the stability of fossil capitalism. Its legitimacy is very much a combination of structural power of capital itself, but also the agency of these organizations, lobbying organizations, that get to the government in different ways and influence specific political decisions.
Both things.
Yes, both at once.
All at once.
Yeah.
So into greenwashing and techno-greenwashing, I think it can be important to name and shame. There's lots of turning a blind eye to these culprits. But more in an effort to lift the veil, are there any instances of techno or just standard greenwashing, be that a product or service, that we should be addressing, or something that really irks you, especially? Yeah.
Well, I think one of the things that is probably at the top of the greenwashing list are carbon offsets, and you can see these, especially if you're booking a flight, right? You can pay extra money in order to have the carbon that is being emitted and can be attributed to you as a passenger on the airplane. That money that you pay in the carbon offset is theoretically going to some organization that will endeavor to offset the carbon emissions from your flight somewhere else in the world, right? But there are so many scams, there's so much fraud built into the system of carbon offsets and generally the market-based models for trying to manage and deal with the climate crisis. There's so many ways in which corporations can make the claim that they are investing, the money from the carbon offset in something, typically in the global south, that actually is fixing the same amount of carbon. Carbon offsets are permission to pollute, basically. But the idea is that the same amount of carbon is being fixed somewhere else in the world. The problem is with the second part of the proposition, because in many cases in these projects, the forest that's being talked about as the place where the carbon is being fixed would be there anyway. So there's no actual, it's total fraud at that point. In other cases, it's less totally fraudulent, but there's overestimates of what really can be counted in terms of fixing carbon. And then we have the problem, if we look at forest fires like wildfires in Canada today, they become so extensive, and not just in Canada, all over the place actually, that the forests that we, just until a few years ago, were carbon sinks. That is, they were fixing carbon and preventing carbon from being in the atmosphere in that sense. They have now become carbon bombs. And the Canadian boreal forest is emitting more carbon each year than it's fixing because of all the wildfires. So this idea that you can buy these offsets and you're getting a forest that's going to fix the carbon, well, the forests are burning down. So it's a really, I guess I would say that's right at the top of the list in terms of greenwashing, the idea that carbon offsets really are a way of dealing, but we could make a similar analysis of other aspects of climate capitalism, because most of it is just not really going to be effective. But these kinds of things, in terms of greenwashing, it goes way back. I mean, I can remember, one of our great public intellectuals and ecologists in Canada, of course, is David Suzuki. And I think 2 decades ago, he was featured on television, these public service commercials, if you like, announcements, where he would be basically getting people to change their light bulbs, right? And the idea, and he took it seriously at the time, that, if you can it's just this kind of consumer-based approach to solving the climate crisis. Get everybody to change their light bulbs from the Thomas Edison incandescent light bulb that uses a lot of energy to the fluorescent light bulb or something like that uses much less energy. And, it's just like the idea that natural gas is a transition fuel. Like, this is another greenwashing scam, right? Natural gas is a fossil fuel. It, in terms of the final burning of the natural gas at some, power plant or whatever it is, or somebody's home, that natural gas burns cleaner than coal, and its carbon footprint is considerably less than coal. But the problem is, in extracting natural gas, it's quite well documented that there are fugitive emissions of natural gas. And natural gas is something like 18 times as powerful a greenhouse gas than oil. But what it means is that if you actually look at the complete carbon footprint of natural gas, it's actually slightly worse than coal. So all of these scams, and schemes to create the natural gas, the LNG efforts in Canada, all these pipelines, and everybody talking about how natural gas burns clean and so on and so forth. This is total greenwashing. Natural gas is a fossil fuel, and every time you burn natural gas, you're contributing to carbon emissions by definition. There's no way around that, actually. And as I say, if you add up the total carbon footprint, given fugitive emissions at the point of extraction and transport, natural gas is even worse than coal. So, and people with any scientific knowledge know that. So people in the industry know that. And of course, we know that Exxon scientists in the 1970s identified global warming as a result of burning fossil fuels. This was known and covered up by Exxon. There are legal cases right now before the courts, about the fraud involved there. So, I guess I could go on and on about this, right? There's such a pattern of greenwashing and denialism, and it is one of the major contributing factors in terms of legitimating fossil capitalism, sort of reassuring people that there's nothing to see here. It's going to all be okay.
And here's the next best thing.
Yeah, next best thing, yeah.
Well, thank you. I think it's important to to call those things out and to identify them for people that maybe aren't thinking about them, and rightfully so.
Yeah, and you can see how David Suzuki himself redirected, right? After his his thing as a light bulb salesperson or whatever he was doing there, because he is a scientist, he began to realize the scope and scale of the crisis over the intervening 2 decades. And now, if you read interviews with him, I read an interview with him just a couple of weeks ago. He is extremely critical of capitalism, and he says we need a revolution. This is what he is saying, right? So you can see people who are paying attention to the scope and scale of the crisis have in the past couple of decades. I think David Suzuki is a good example of how a principled, well-informed person will come around to a position that's, that recognizes the urgency of the situation.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Then pull you into my scope of the podcast and internet culture and what we're doing online. You've taught many students over the years. Certainly social justice and activism have taken new shapes, but it's not new to stand up to injustice at all. So witnessing the uptick of personal devices and expanding social media over the last few decades, have you noticed changes in students' maybe abilities or desires to mobilize social movements?
Yeah, I think it's sort of, there are pluses and minuses. I think the internet culture has, on the one hand, it does make it easier to communicate and to pull communities together, online communities and so on. And that's a great thing. But on the other hand, I think there are certain patterns of behavior that the internet encourages. Well, there's like, people get caught in their bubbles, and so they get a lot of self-confirming messages because of the way that Web 2.0 works. It actually directs you toward websites that you've visited often and so on and so forth. So you get this kind of bubble phenomenon, internet bubbles. And that actually breaks down the capacity to really get a broader perspective and connect with broader communities, So it has a fragmenting impact that can, I think, really go against the grain of broad social movement organizing. And then, you have other tendencies toward, as I was mentioning before, people thinking that clicktivism is a major form of activism. I mean, it is. I don't dismiss it. I do it myself, right? But, it's just that, and it is, on the one hand, it's an example of how the internet makes it very easy to participate politically. But on the other hand, how much is really being accomplished, and is this really a tangible form of organizing compared to face-to-face organizing, let's say, that kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of norms and I guess just pathways that people have taken up in terms of online communication that tend to work against the idea of solidarity and empathy, often reinforcing the atomization phenomenon we were talking about earlier. The internet can, on the one hand, it's a means of connecting, but it can also be fragmenting and atomizing.
I was sort of thinking along that line of, this isolation and the anonymity that it can provide as well. Then tech oligarchs, and also on top of the filter bubbles that we're seeing, then you throw in the algorithms, and then you throw in censorship of what's appropriate. And it gets really messy. And so we think that there's maybe this transparency that can help us connect people. But I just wanted to know your take into this next bit of, do you think that social media and other online spaces can aid in building the historical bloc around the proletariat? That's a little clip from your book, but
Yeah. Well, there's no doubt that the internet is an important tool, I mean, from a historical materialist perspective, we could talk about the forces of production. And, often people think of that term, they think of factories and smokestacks. But the internet is a really good example of the contemporary forces of production. And, Marx's point about the forces of production? Well, one of the important points was that in a class society, the forces of production develop under the control of the dominant class. It controls the means of production, and so controls the new technologies and implements them in a way that will, satisfy its interests, right? Primarily. And so we can see that with the internet. Like the internet, it begins as a kind of military project of communication, but then it has, when it becomes the World Wide Web, in this, early phase, right? It actually, it's an unintended consequence of the military decisions is to create this kind of infrastructure for a digital communication that for a few years, I remember this in the 1990s that, the early internet, World Wide Web, people had a lot of utopian fantasies, if you like, about how this was this was going to bring humanity together in a decommodified way. We'd be able to communicate and create a new commons, right? A kind of knowledge commons. And all of that's wonderful. And I think that has happened to some extent. But, so people talk about Wikipedia or Napster or indie media, in the late 1990s. And, but, ultimately, the forces of production in a capitalist society develop under the control of the capitalist class. We see this now with the tech oligarchs, right? They're controlling. And the internet has basically, in the past 3 decades, it's become, this kind of just vehicle of capitalist profit. It's one of the most profitable lines of economic activity, the incredible rents that these, internet corporations extract from the users who are engaged in essentially free labor, that is unwaged labor. There, when you're producing products for the tech oligarchs, basically, and through your online activity, and your demographic data are being harvested and sold to other corporations and so on. This is not really an expression of human freedom. It's just a new phase in capital accumulation. But at the same time, the internet has there is a kind of knowledge commons aspect to it that has developed in parallel with the increasing corporate colonization and domination of the internet. So it's a good example of the contradictory impact of new forces of production. That they develop under capitalist control, but the control isn't complete. People can do things. There's always a margin for intervening and creatively bending things to your interests rather than simply going along the predetermined path, which is following in the interests of the dominant class.
Thank you. It is such a contradiction. And I see so many benefits. And then at the end of the day, it is a product of the capitalistic society.
Yeah.
So all of my questions. I like to leave the end of my podcast with your message to the world, sort of your soapbox.
My soapbox.
Yeah. Anything you'd like to share? The floor is yours.
Yes. Well, I think you can see from the conversation that I'm not that optimistic about things in the current situation, but I think it's important to leave people with the thought that the future is open, and it depends on what we do. What will happen. This kind of the reason why my most recent book is called Refusing Ecocide is because it's still possible to refuse ecocide, and we can actually build a different world. But I think the clock is ticking, and I think it's really past time for people to try to figure out what kind of contribution each of us can make to refusing ecocide and building a socially just alternative.
Amazing. Thank you, Bill.
You're welcome.
Wow, that is some food for thought. I'm so grateful to have had Bill on, and I hope this got you thinking about refusing ecocide. You can find both Bill's book and a link to the corporate mapping project in the description of this post. And you can find more from me at KennyC402 on Substack. Thanks for listening. Keep sleuthing.